What's up, everybody? I'm Ryan Donnelly, and you are watching Paradigm Sherpas, the channel where we consider new paradigms of thinking and being. And today we're going to blow our minds looking at the origins of the internet. We're going to review a book called Surveillance Valley, The Secret Military History of the Internet. Now, before we talk about the book, let's learn a little bit about the author. The author is a man named Yasha Levine. Levine is a Soviet American journalist and writer. He grew up in modern day Russia, but at a young age, he and his family moved to San Francisco. Levine also runs a Substack titled Nefarious Russians. So if you want to keep up with his latest work, go check him out on Substack. He's also pretty active on Twitter or X. Now, before we start talking about the book, I want to read for you a little excerpt about it. Surveillance Valley traces the history of the internet back to its beginnings as a Vietnam era tool for spying on guerrilla fighters and anti-war protesters, a military computer networking project that ultimately envisioned the creation of a global system of surveillance and prediction. Levine shows how the same military objectives that drove the development of early internet technology are still at the heart of Silicon Valley today. Spies, counterinsurgency campaigns, hippie entrepreneurs, and privacy apps funded by the CIA. From the 1960s to the 2010s, this revelatory and sweeping story will make you reconsider what you know about the most powerful, ubiquitous tool ever created. Levine starts the book by taking us back to the Vietnam War and emphasizes that the Vietnam War was really the catalyst in a lot of ways for the creation of the internet. Now, a few things about the Vietnam War. First and foremost, this war was one of the longest wars the United States had fought at the time. It lasted 15 years, from 1959 to 1975. And throughout the conflict, over 400,000 civilians were killed, including 58,000 United States soldiers. The Vietnam War was different from previous wars like Korea and World War II, which were fought with conventional armies. The Vietnam War was characterized as a counterinsurgency effort. This was a lot different fighting style that the United States was used to. And as we'll find out, they needed to find new tactics to meet the challenge of fighting a counterinsurgency. And they relied upon the help of a internal military think tank called ARPA, or the Advanced Research Projects Agency. Some of you may be familiar with DARPA, or the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. This was the predecessor group, or the first onset of that group. So ARPA comes up with this project called Project Agile, where they suggest all these new tactics, technologies, methodologies, etc., to help the US fight this counterinsurgency. So there's this sub-project within Project Agile that ARPA comes up with, and it's called Operation Ranch Hand. And according to Levine, throughout Operation Ranch Hand, over 2 million gallons of chemical defoliants were dumped on the Vietnamese jungles. The idea behind this was that they were going to destroy the enemy crops, as well as the crops that the North Vietnamese civilians relied on to feed themselves. This would prevent the army from feeding itself and potentially make civilians turn on the North Vietnamese soldiers because they want the conflict to end because they want to feed themselves. Now, Operation Ranch Hand had some devastating consequences for the Vietnamese citizenry as well as U.S. soldiers. There was a particularly nasty chemical that you might be familiar with called Agent Orange. The U.S. dumped 2 million gallons of Agent Orange over the Vietnamese jungle, and it created tons of birth defects within future Vietnamese populations, as well as created all types of awful cancers amongst U.S. veterans that they had to deal with when they came home. Levine continues the story about how ARPA suggested these various different ways of fighting counterinsurgency. He tells us about a sub-project within Agile called Operation Igloo White. Now, the idea behind Igloo White's pretty simple. Put a bunch of sensors along the Ho Chi Minh Trail so that the U.S. can be notified when the North Vietnamese army is moving along at night. Now, what ended up happening was the North Vietnamese figured out pretty quickly that these sensors existed. So what they did was they purposely tripped the sensors. That information was sent to the US military, who then sent planes in to bomb the area. And all it did was clear the area out so that the North Vietnamese could move more efficiently through the now sensorless jungle. So kind of a spectacular failure, but part of one of ARPA's strategies for fighting counterinsurgency. So we've talked a little bit about the new strategies for fighting this counterinsurgency warfare, but it's probably appropriate to take a few steps back and talk about the development of the computer and how that comes into play with all this in the future. So Levine takes us back in time and introduces something called the Hollerith tabulation machine. This was a punch card technology that was created by a guy named Dr. Herman Hollerith, and it was essentially used in the early 1800s, or I'm sorry, the late 1800s, to assist with census efforts. Basically, you punch in things about yourself for the census, and that gets inserted to a machine that can analyze the results way faster than a human being could do on their own. So the Hollerith tabulation machine accelerates productivity and computation beyond the capabilities of a single human being. And it's really effective for assisting the census. Unfortunately, that technology was used for nefarious reasons as well. If you look over to Nazi Germany, IBM helped create a tabulation machine for the Nazis that was used to identify various ethnic groups and label them as undesirable. So I guess the moral of the story is, like always, technology can be a double-edged sword. So we go from the Hollerith tabulation machine and we fast forward to this giant building-like computer called the ENIAC. This was the first computer, absolutely massive, much bigger than the cell phone you're watching this on or the laptop potentially that you're using today. Now, we go from the first computer to the first computer network, and the first computer network was something called SAGE. It was basically an effort to link all of the radar data in the United States so that we could have a cohesive vision of all the radar information to protect the homeland. We've zipped through the creation of the computer. And, if you want to learn more about that, go crazy, but I'm not going to bore you with it. Basically, there was this fast movement from the tabulation machine to the first computer to the first computer network. Now, in comes in this guy, JCR Licklider, or Lick. And Lick was an American psychologist and computer scientist, and he basically had the vision for what he called the Great Intergalactic Network. It was basically the internet. So this guy's really a visionary, but he's not the one who actually lays the foundation to make it come to be. Before you can get Lick's great intergalactic network, you need a guy like Norbert Wiener. Norbert Wiener was a brilliant mathematician, computer scientist, and philosopher. He actually was a very staunch anti-war activist in his later life. But he did help the US military figure out how to shoot their long guns and change trajectories in a much faster fashion than was originally done. It used to be this, multi-hundred step manual that you had to go through in order to change trajectories. And if you're fighting a battle, you don't really have time to go through hundreds of steps. You're going to get killed. So Wiener originally helped the U.S. military come up with a computational process for firing guns much more efficiently. And Wiener is then moves on to really cement his name in the field of computer science. He comes up with this concept of cybernetics. So, cybernetics is an interdisciplinary field that deals with the study of communication and control systems in machines and living beings. The term cybernetics was coined by Norbert Wiener in the 1940s. He also wrote a book about it. Okay, so we've talked about the Hollerith tabulation machine, the ENIAC computer, the first computer network called the SAGE network, used for radar systems. We talked about Licklider and the great intergalactic network that he envisioned, and Norbert Wiener coming along and creating cybernetics that helped fast track making this a reality. But where the rubber hits the road is with a guy named Larry Roberts. Larry Roberts is the ARPANET program manager. He's the one tasked by the US military to really bring the great intergalactic network to reality. And in 1969, the ARPANET, the first instantiation of this network, goes live. There's four nodes to the ARPANET. One is in Utah, one is in UCLA, another is at University of California, Santa Barbara, and then the most infamous group of all, Stanford Research Institute in Palo Alto. And once the ARPANET goes online, the military sets their sights on how to use this tool for prediction and social control. And this caused a lot of controversy among intellectuals, computer scientists, as well as Ivy League students who saw what was going on in the periphery. Now, the US military came up with something called Project Cambridge, or I'm sorry, the Cambridge Project. And the idea was to use the internet as a tool for predictive analysis and social control. It had to deal with things like fighting counterinsurgency, ghetto pacification, strike breaking, student protests, and black militancy. And there was a huge uprising among student populations who were part of the peripheral efforts. They saw the writing on the wall. They feared the so-called octoputer that would take over our lives and turn us into automatons. Now, things got even dicier when the US military introduced something called Project Camelot. Project Camelot was the internet for social control on steroids. It was really the early version of what is present day Palantir, the company created by Alex Karp and Peter Thiel. Now, a guy named Christopher Pyle broke a news story to a lot of the US newspapers, including the ACLU, that helped make people hip to Project Camelot. It was canceled and was also talked about at length in the church hearings. This guy, Chris Pyle, ended up being an advisor to Senator Frank Church, who was attempting to reform the U.S. military industrial complex and spy agencies in a series of sessions that led to the creation of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, as well as the Senate Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. So Levine's walked us through the military history of the internet, but he also talks to us about the man who privatized the internet, a guy named Stephen Wolfe. Stephen Wolfe basically worked for the National Science Foundation, which was tasked with commercializing the internet, or the ARPANET at the time. And so he created this thing called the NSF net. It basically leveraged the same infrastructure as the ARPANET, but it was meant to be made available first to academics, but then for commercial purposes. Now, Levine points out that this was kind of a sly deal. So taxpayers funded the creation of the ARPANET and the NSF net. But when Wolf was done with his efforts, he just handed it off to some of the big telecoms that were already involved. And he refers to this as a sly deal because there's no conversation about who is going to take over this infrastructure that taxpayers had paid for. Instead, it goes to a few companies and they become the absolute massive telecoms giants that you hear today. Now, these groups only got bigger, according to Levine, when Bill Clinton deregulated the telecommunications industry by signing the Telecommunications Act in 1996. This basically threw out all competition and gave the power to dominate the markets to the groups you see here on the screen. So, yes, the internet was a military tool and still is to this day, but it eventually made its way out to the public for commercial purposes. And one of the people in charge of rebranding, if you will, the image of the internet was a guy named Stuart Brand. Stuart Brand was a very popular journalist for Rolling Stone. He was actually a part of the MK Ultra psychedelic mind control experiments by the CIA. Brand was convinced that the internet and computer technology was going to lead us on a trajectory towards utopia. So that's the vision he pumped out and promoted to the public. There's no better example of a marketing campaign for the internet as a tool for utopia than the creation of Wired magazine. Wired magazine came on the scene in 1996, and it really served as this marketing engine to make Silicon Valley look cool, look like Silicon Valley was sticking it to the man. Silicon Valley has this vision for utopia, and they're going to take control of social movement and propel us into the future that's no longer dominated by evil, heartless minds. So on the one hand, you have Stuart Brand and Wired Magazine trying to paint Silicon Valley as a group of messiahs that are going to take us to utopia. But the actuality of the situation is much different than that. So let's talk a little bit about Google. We all know Google, most of us use it today. Levine says that 25% of North American internet traffic runs through Google servers. So Google basically gets famous because there's these two guys at Stanford, Sergey Brin and Larry Page. They work on an algorithm for search engines called PageRank. Basically, PageRank is the idea that you're going to promote a website based on the number of quality links that point to it. And their efforts at Stanford with PageRank were actually funded by the Digital Libraries Initiative, something that got money from the National Science Foundation, NASA, and DARPA. Yes, the same DARPA that was the follow-up to ARPA that created the internet. So these guys got their funding, in part from a military organization. Google has its roots in the military at the very beginning. But that only continues as Google evolves. So Levine talks about the trajectory of Google after the creation of Google search. Google decides that they're going to package up their search algorithms into a Dell 2U server and hand it over to the CIA and the NSA. The idea being that the CIA and NSA can now have a Google-like search of all of their data, and all of their data is things that they collect on folks like you and me. Now, Google keeps rolling out these enterprise technologies. In 2004, they bought an In-Q-Tel funded group called Keyhole. So if you don't know about In-Q-Tel is the venture capital arm of the CIA. Basically, the CIA funds all these interesting technologies in hopes that they can become companies that the CIA can leverage for various projects. And Google buys this In-Q-Tel funded company called Keyhole that was mapping the entire Earth. And then they turn around and start selling applications to the US military and US spy agencies in the form of Google Earth. So Google partnered up with a lot of these agencies like the NSA, the NRO, the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency to provide Google Earth as a service. Google only keeps growing, right? They then roll out Gmail for both businesses, government agencies, and it's a service that they provide to folks like you and me for free. Now, Levine warns us that Google has the right, excuse me, Levine warns us that Google has the right to read all of our emails. That's within the fine print. So there's nothing private about what we're doing on Google infrastructure, at least as it relates to Gmail. Now, maybe that's a little bit different if you're the government or you have an enterprise contract with them. But at least for civilian use of Gmail, Google has the ability to see everything we're writing. And they create profiles of us of that. And I'll go into a little bit more detail about that in a minute because Levine brings it up. It's not just Google. There's a lot of other companies that are doing this to us. But I guess the final point to illustrate is that Google is a company with its original model was don't be evil, yet it is helping U.S. intelligence agencies conduct a lot of illegal operations against the U.S. public. Now, I think this is probably one of the most interesting comments from a Google executive that I've ever heard to help illustrate the power of Google. Um, I want you to listen to this clip from the CEO, Eric Schmidt. He basically says, we don't need you to type anymore. So, Levine's talking about how Google creates these profiles of us, and you would think it is done based on what you type into a Google search bar, or at least that's one of the ways. But Eric Schmidt's saying, no, no, no. We have so much information on you based on your Google Maps history, your Google search history, what we can see from your Gmail. We know more about you probably than you know about yourself. And so we don't need you to search. We already know.
So one of the things that eventually happens in that preceding line of reasoning is we don't need you to type at all because we know where you are with your permission. We know where you've been with your permission. We can more or less guess what you're thinking about.
So this is where Levine introduces a guy named Edward Snowden. A lot of you may be familiar with Snowden. He was a contractor working for the NSA that ended up leaking a bunch of documents about a program called PRISM. The suggestion here is that the United States, or the NSA in particular, is spying illegally on US citizens. So Snowden works for this group called Booz Allen Hamilton. They are the biggest contractor to the United States intelligence apparatus, and they are a subsidiary of something called the Carlyle Group. There's two prominent families were a part of the Carlyle Group. The Bush family, George H.W., George W., as well as the Bin Laden family. Yes, the Saudi oil family, the Bin Ladens. They actually had very close relationships with the Bushes. And prior to 9/11, both Bush and Bin Laden were part of the Carlyle Group. And you can even see there's a New York Times article that came out shortly after 9/11 that suggested that the Bin Laden family then backed out of the Carlyle Group. There is a book that's out there that goes into detail about the relationship between the Bush family and Saudi Arabian elites. If you want to take a look at it, it's called The House of Bush and House of Saud by Craig Unger. So Snowden leaks these documents about this program called PRISM. And if you look at the slides here, you can see that PRISM basically touches all of the Silicon Valley companies that regular Americans used frequently. You have Microsoft, Yahoo, Google, Facebook, YouTube, AOL, Skype, Apple, etc. Going back to 2007, Prism was collecting secretly this data. The thing that Levine tells us, though, is that it wasn't so secret to these companies, that they're actually willing accomplices. And only when Snowden leaked this information did these companies cry foul and say, we didn't know about this. These were backdoors that we had no idea about, and we don't support this. But Levine says, no, that's completely dishonest. These groups were willing accomplices and purposely fed this information to the United States intelligence agencies. So I don't know if you noticed, but when I showed that slide of Edward Snowden, there's a sticker on his computer for a technology called Tor. The topic of Tor comes up at the end of the book, where Levine's talking about internet privacy funded by spies. So Snowden basically popularizes the idea that Tor, or the onion router, is a technology that can be used to hide your footprint on the internet. And thus, if you're a whistleblower, you can use it to leak information to the press to get it out to the public. Well, it's not exactly accurate according to Levine. Levine suggests that Tor really doesn't protect you from groups like the NSA or the CIA. They can easily figure out who you are while you're using it. One of the real things that Levine wants to point out is that Tor itself came from government funding in part. So it's already had this connection to spy agencies from the beginning. It was used by spy agencies to conduct espionage in foreign countries. Basically, you'd use the onion router to hide your footprint while you're a spy or a CIA asset in some foreign country. But the US intelligence agencies definitely know how to identify people using Tor. And there's nobody that learned that lesson that Tor wasn't something that could be trusted more than Ross Ulbricht. Ross Ulbricht was known by his online moniker, the Dread Pirate Roberts. He was the creator of something called the Silk Road. It was basically this marketplace that lived on Tor where you could purchase any illicit service leveraging a Bitcoin as payment. You could buy drugs, you could hire a hitman, which I guess Levine alleges that Ulbricht did try and hire hitmen to kill people who were threatening him while he was running the Silk Road. Ulbricht ends up getting caught by the FBI. He gets sentenced to 2 life sentences. Ulbricht actually recently got released as part of a deal struck between the Libertarian Party and the Trump administration. The Libertarian Party basically said, "All right, we'll throw some weight behind your candidacy, Trump, but we want you to free Ross Ulbricht in exchange." So Ulbricht is now walking free because of the Libertarian Party, but also, from what I understand, his mom was relentless in petitioning to get him free. So Levine also talks about, another app that was created by spies for spies. That's Signal. People think that using Signal today is a way to have secure messaging, but it's actually more of like a honeypot for intelligence agencies where you've now narrowed the field to people who don't want to be spied on, basically. So Signal creates a smaller field for the CIA and the NSA to search through. They have backdoors into this stuff. This stuff was originally funded by these spy agencies, according to Levine, because they wanted to use them. So they know how they operate and they know how to penetrate and they know how to get at your data. So that's basically the short of the book. I rambled a lot. I'm sorry. Apologies to Yasha Levine if I bastardized the representation of your book. I really enjoyed it. I'd encourage everybody to go out and get a copy of it, read it, promote it. It's very worthwhile to understand where the internet came from to help us know where it's going today. So thanks, everybody. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll look forward to catching up with you the next time. See ya.